Hello everyone, this is the mind of Lilith, and thank you for joining me for part 1 of my astrological analysis of the late great Malcolm Little, also known as Malcolm X, also known as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on his Saturn and Pluto placements as well as their respective signs, houses, and aspects. So according to Astro.com, Malcolm X was born on May 19th, 1925 at 10:29 p.m. in Omaha, Nebraska. He is the fourth of 8 children born to Earl and Louise Little. Earl Little was born in the state of Georgia and was a descendant of enslaved Americans, and Louise was from the country of Grenada, which is in the West Indies. She was a child of a white male and an indigenous or native Grenadian woman, to which Malcolm's fair skin and red hair is attributed. We can see the cultural difference between Malcolm's parents, with Saturn representing the father, opposing the moon representing the mother. When Louise Little was pregnant with Malcolm, the KKK terrorized her home while her husband was away at work. This event foreshadowed his tumultuous and tragic life. But first, I'm going to walk through his chart before I start the interpretation, okay? So based on the equal house system, Malcolm's sun is at 29 degrees of Taurus conjunct his sun sign ruler of Venus at 5 degrees of Gemini in the 5th house of fun, creativity, and children. His Venus forms a sextile with Uranus and a trine with Jupiter, denoting exceptional intelligence, curiosity, and a natural attractiveness or charm. Malcolm's sun is conjunct the fixed star of Algol and the Pleiades, both of which are considered unfortunate and can cause beheading, murder, homosexuality, tragedy, blindness, and mob violence. The blindness can be literal or figurative, denoting loss of eyesight or being blindsided by a situation. Malcolm's moon is at 29 degrees of Aries in the 4th house of the family, mother, ancestry, inherited land, and the home. Although his moon, Mars, and Pluto are not in a square aspect by degree, they are all cardinal energies in angular houses, which indicates that Malcolm experienced a lot of instability and crises throughout his life. His moon is conjunct the fixed star of Alrisha, which represents humanitarian efforts, diplomacy, and the desire to reconcile differences between different groups of people. This fixed star has a Piscean type of energy, indicating self-sacrifice for the greater good and adherence to a belief system or ritualistic practice. The sun represents what we want and the moon represents what we need. So Malcolm X had a need or an emotional desire to connect with groups of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different religions, different races, etc. Malcolm's moon is conjunct with Chiron, so there was an open wound about his parents, his home life, his family, his country of origin, and his childhood. He never truly had a home to call his own. And, when he was in his mother's womb, the KKK firebombed him and smashed the windows of his childhood home, and the Nation of Islam firebombed his home with his wife and children inside because they didn't want their cash cow to expose their corruption. So throughout his life, we can see that Malcolm's stability and his foundations were constantly being disrupted, especially since Pluto is 3 houses away in the 7th house, which forms a square, okay? Malcolm's ascendant was at 5 degrees of Capricorn in the same house as Jupiter in Capricorn at 22 degrees. In spite of all his challenges, Malcolm was very lucky, or he had the ability to create his own luck through hard work, dedication, and his leadership qualities. His ascendant is conjunct the fixed star of Caus Borealis, which represents justice, an enterprising or entrepreneurial mindset, idealistic humanitarianism, and gathering information. With Jupiter square the moon, Malcolm's optimism led him to jump headfirst into situations without considering the long-term consequences. He often overestimated his abilities and made his life more difficult than he had to in accordance with his strict principles and morals that were given to him by his mother. With Jupiter in the 1st house, Malcolm was a righteous leader who was honored to fulfill his role, which ultimately rubbed the leaders of the Nation of Islam the wrong way. He refused the devil's offer at the temple and the mountaintop and was executed for it, just like Jesus Christ. The ruler of Malcolm's 12th house of Sagittarius is in the 1st house. So the 12th house ruler is in the 1st house. And the 12th house represents endings, betrayals, secrets, imprisonment, and assassination. Malcolm's short life was littered with these experiences, but he followed his mother's advice and made prison serve him instead of serving time in prison. He used the energy of Saturn to make his imprisonment productive and useful, and he became an avid reader and debater in prison. And the NOI pretty much benefited from his hard work. They didn't make Malcolm. Malcolm was already made when he came out of prison. And because he had significant earth sign placements with Capricorn on the ascendant and Sun in Taurus, he had the ability to plant, to build, to harvest, and not just talk rhetoric. He inherited the ability to build tangible things from his father, who was a carpenter. In fact, Malcolm and his brother were the ones who taught the Nation of Islam how to build wealth, and in return for these gifts, he was killed just as the Romans killed Jesus and then used his murder to make money for the institution that killed him. Same shit, different continent, different millennia. Even though the Nation of Islam maligns Malcolm X, without him, they would not be where they are to this day. Malcolm's Saturn, his chart ruler, is at 9 degrees of Scorpio, opposing the moon and Chiron in the 11th house, which indicates a break or split between the parents and emotional, psychological, or physical separation from the mother. Allegedly, Malcolm's father was killed by a white supremacist terrorist group called the Black Legion when he was around 5 years old. Prior to his death, Malcolm's father struggled with insecurities regarding his wife Louise's education and intellect, and he occasionally abused her to assert his dominance. Malcolm's mother, Louise, was a free spirit. She was fierce, independent, and courageous, as evidenced by his moon in Aries. Unfortunately, his moon is in conjunction with Chiron, opposing Saturn, which indicates that his mother suffered from a helpless or hopeless situation and experiences that caused her deep sorrow. Her husband was killed, 2 of her sons predeceased her, and the state took all of her children and placed them in foster homes, and she was forcefully institutionalized in a mental health facility for 25 years so that the state could steal her land from her. So, colonizers and invaders of indigenous lands, they often use these tactics of separating the mother from the children to destroy the culture and to allow the child to be indoctrinated in the ways of their oppressors, as we see with Barack Obama. So what the colonizers do is, they impregnate a native woman or they adopt a native child. They bring him to the colonizer's country. They indoctrinate the child, brainwash the child, and then make the child the leader of their native land. But they have a European mindset. And this is how we have these puppet leaders in the Caribbean and in Africa and in the States who are selected to fill these leadership roles for the benefit of European companies and corporations. Okay? So what happened to Malcolm's mother and family was not unique. This is something that happens to this day, to be honest. Okay. Malcolm has Uranus in the 3rd house of communication, thinking, speech, early education, and travel. Uranus represents inspiration, genius, electricity, speed, and independence. Malcolm had a psychic intelligence with the ability to subsume large amounts of information within a short period of time. He was an avid reader, debater, writer, and an excellent public speaker with a brilliant critical mind. Neptune is conjunct the North Node and Leo in the 8th house, squares Saturn and Scorpio in the 11th house. Okay, so Neptune represents deception, obfuscation, illusion, mystery, and a lack of clarity. Neptune is also square the midheaven, which means that Malcolm has a lot of secrets that persist to this day. The dynamic relationships between the NOI, the FBI, the Weather Underground, the CIA, and other organizations are extraordinarily complex and fascinating, and Malcolm's life experiences are tied to these institutions in some form or fashion. I'm not going to get into that today, but yeah, it's very complicated. So the circumstances of Malcolm's father's death were hidden for decades. Just like the circumstances surrounding Malcolm's assassination was unclear for a long time. Who was responsible? Was it the FBI or the NOI? And throughout this presentation, you'll come to see a lot of parallels in Malcolm's life and his parents' life, because we inherit our parents' birth charts the same way we inherit their genetics and their appearance. Malcolm has Pluto and Mars in Cancer opposing his Capricorn ascendant at 6 degrees and 11 degrees respectively. This challenging aspect is largely responsible for much of the tragedies that Malcolm experienced in his life, as Pluto forces us to evolve in areas represented by the sign and the house that it is in. Because Pluto is in the 7th house, Malcolm's tumultuous relationships with others compel him to evolve and thus change his identity multiple times. Again, he was born Malcolm Little, then he became Malcolm X, and then he died as El-Hajj Malik. All of these identities represent a stage and phase in his spiritual development. Plutonian individuals, Scorpios, people with Pluto conjunct the Sun, the Moon, ascendant, square, Sun, Moon, ascendant. Plutonian people go through many crises and challenges because there's like an innate, compulsive, obsessive desire to break through karmic blocks and stagnation that prevent these people from experiencing self-actualization. These karmic blocks can come from social systems, relationships, family dynamics, culture, and even health conditions. With Pluto in the 7th house, Malcolm was determined to not be controlled by anyone, anything, or any ideology that could prevent him from finding out who he truly was. He was determined to discover the truth about himself and live in his truth regardless of how it affected others, much to the chagrin of the Nation of Islam, who tried to control him and manipulate him for their benefit. This is what happened to African Americans, or descendants of slaves in the States, where our energy and our life force was used to benefit someone else. This is very Plutonian. This is Pluto in Cancer, okay? Cancer represents the nativity, the homeland, the family, history, and culture. And with Pluto here, a person can be tied to outdated cultural norms and expectations that hinders our evolution. And I'll discuss that later on, okay? So Malcolm has the North Node in Leo in the 8th house. At the end of his life, Malcolm was a celebrity. And with the 8th house North Node with Saturn in Scorpio, Malcolm will most likely reincarnate again, but under much different circumstances. He will have the opportunity to selfishly enjoy the stability, the peace, the wealth, the honor, and the opulence that was denied him in his previous lifetime. Leo in the 8th house can sometimes indicate royalty or head of state, okay? So now on to Saturn. In astrology, Saturn represents history, legacy, karmic debts, responsibilities, jealousy, delays, obstacles, and often indicates the cause of death. Saturn also governs time, that which stands the test of time, that which is destroyed over time, the passage of time, and death caused by old age. Malcolm had Saturn and Scorpio in the 11th house. Scorpio is the sign of metamorphosis, betrayal, crises, mysteries, secrets, energy transference, power, and death. And the 11th house represents the collective, society, friendships, groups, associations, organizations, and humanitarianism. Because Malcolm's Saturn is ruled by Mars and Pluto, we have to take a look at which house Mars and Pluto are located to determine where this energy is coming from. Malcolm X ascendant is in Capricorn, which means that his chart ruler is Saturn. And again, this planet is in the sign of Scorpio in the 11th house, ruled by Pluto and Mars. Although he was a Taurus, Malcolm experienced Plutonian situations throughout his life. Crisis, tragedy, trauma, anguish, betrayal, metamorphosis, and violence. As Pluto is in the sign of Cancer, these themes are connected with his family, his bloodline, and his nation of origin. At the end of his life, Malcolm was not only an enemy of the state of the United States, but he was being hunted down by the Nation of Islam, who had successfully separated him from his friends and family. He essentially was a king without a kingdom, wearing a crown of thorns, about to be crucified for the same reasons Jesus was, because he was about to break up the money racket that the Nation of Islam was participating in. So the square aspect between the moon and the ascendant revealed that Malcolm was willing to break away from tradition, authority, and hierarchy for emotional freedom and autonomy. From a young age, he learned that he could not trust anyone or anything, and that he had to rely on himself for survival. To accomplish this, he had to keep a safe distance from people, which made it difficult for him to form truly intimate relationships. Now, when we see Saturn in Scorpio or Saturn in the 8th house, this can indicate sexual frigidity or emotional distance during the act of sex, for fear of truly merging with another person, because merging requires vulnerability, trust, and love, all of which was denied to Malcolm at a young age, as we can see with the Saturn-Moon opposition. This emotional and sexual frigidity can happen as a result of sexual abuse or some other type of extreme trauma that damages a person's ability to trust other people. I honestly wonder if Malcolm experienced some form of extreme physical or sexual abuse while he was in the care of his white foster parents. I'm not saying this with any certainty, but I would not be surprised if Malcolm was violated or abused while in the care of the same white neighbors who sought to destroy his family and steal their land. To this day, we read about many stories of black foster children being routinely and ritualistically abused by their white caregivers. Okay, and this is a tradition and a military tactic that was passed down for centuries to destroy indigenous people on every continent. I'm not saying that all white foster parents do this to their black adopted children, because that's not true. But there are several markers in Malcolm's chart that indicate severe abuse, which may have ultimately led him into a life of crime as a numbers man and a pimp. The Chiron moon conjunction shows that Malcolm sought to heal his relationship with himself by fighting for his nation and for his people. Malcolm's sun and moon were in anaretic or fated degrees, okay? And this degree of the moon in Aries, square Pluto in Cancer, gave him the strength and the courage to transmute his anger, grief, and depression into righteousness and courage. Saturn opposing the moon not only caused an emotional or physical separation between the parents, but between the mother and the child as well. And because Chiron is part of this aspect, this detachment or disconnection is beyond the mother's control. So no matter how hard Louis Little fought, Saturn would deny her peace, longevity, and comfort with her husband and her children because the white terrorists wanted her husband's land, as indicated by Saturn in Scorpio. Now remember, Scorpio represents other people's resources, and this sign opposes Taurus, which represents what we own and value. It is highly likely that Malcolm's father was killed because the white supremacists wanted to take his land because he was an indigenous man from Georgia. Scorpio also represents family generations and materials that are inherited through the bloodline, which is why it involves estates, insurance payouts, taxes, divorce settlements, inheritances, etc. If you take a bird's eye view of the situation in Malcolm's life, you can see that Malcolm was killed for the same reasons his father was killed. When Saturn is involved, experiences are repeated until the debt has been paid. But paying this debt for Malcolm has extended his legacy posthumously, as Malcolm is now a venerated ancestor, and in some circles he's been canonized, which is why the males in his family have been hunted to stop him from reincarnating as an ascended master, because he damn sure already paid his dues. Okay, so his next incarnation is not going to be as tragic or traumatic. He may very well likely be born into wealth and prominence. Okay, so now let's take a look at Pluto. In astrology, Pluto represents our compulsive desires and urges to go through experiences that will help us to evolve by breaking away from deeply embedded ways of thinking and being that prevent us from growing. Pluto also represents control, obsession, power, hidden motives, and energy transference by way of manipulation and resource extraction. Malcolm was at the individuated state of evolution since Pluto was opposing his first house of personality, first impressions, and appearances. He was attempting to break away from deeply entrenched cultural norms and traditions that were imposed on him based on race, religion, and the socio-political order of that time. And, this desire to break away was reflected in his rebellious nature. As an adolescent, he routinely challenged authority. And as an adult, he single-handedly fought against powerful institutions like the U.S. government and the Nation of Islam. It was stated that Malcolm's father loved his red hair because it reminded him of David in the Bible. And David defeated the mighty Goliath all by himself with just a rock. So the Goliath would be the Nation of Islam and the U.S. government, right? Pluto in the 7th house is very, 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 very tricky. It's like a double-edged sword. And Whitney Houston had this aspect too. Because it's the house of partnerships, Pluto allows you to forge partnerships with really strong, powerful people. But because Pluto is involved and Pluto rules Scorpio, There are some elements of subversion, manipulation, control, and even danger. We saw what happened to Whitney at the end of her life. I think she has Mars and Pluto in her 7th house too, right? And so in Malcolm's life, Pluto was the white supremacist who terrorized his family as a child. It was the U.S. government who was basically spying on him and trying to infiltrate the NOI to get him assassinated. It was the NOI who was jealous of him because they were afraid that he was going to take over the Nation of Islam while getting rid of the money racket that was going on. And so, yeah, they sought to control Malcolm X. The Nation of Islam sought to control Malcolm X and used him to build their organization without giving him full power and control over it. His relationship with Elijah Muhammad was very complicated because on the one hand, Malcolm respected and revered Elijah Muhammad for starting the Nation of Islam and giving him the platform to elevate himself from his pitiful condition as a pimp and a drug dealer and a criminal. He was grateful to the NOI for that. At the same time, he was not in agreement with the politics and the business practices of the NOI. So now we have a tug of war, right? There's a conflict and a struggle for power, okay? Elijah Muhammad and his 23 children were considered the royal family of the Nation of Islam. And, you know, they weren't too fond of Malcolm X becoming the king of their nation. You know, Malcolm X is having meetings with Muhammad Ali and Jim Brown and Sam Cooke. Like, he is not only celebrated within the nation, he's celebrated within the entertainment industry. So he's like a celebrity. He's like literally the first celebrity activist that we've seen in this country. I mean, Marcus Garvey was pretty popular. W.E. Du Bois was pretty popular. Booker T was pretty popular, but nobody had crossover appeal like Malcolm. And so the Nation of Islam benefited from this exposure, but they were also jealous. Saturn in the 11th house, right? They were jealous of Malcolm X's power and prominence. And they were afraid that they were going to lose control and power over the institution that he helped to build. Even though he didn't create it, without his input, it would have been small potatoes compared to what it was when he died. Okay. So yeah, you know, the Nation of Islam had a problem with him becoming the king. And at some point, the Nation of Islam became a cult and it became deeply corrupted, which is why they haven't really done shit to liberate black people to this day. And the U.S. government pretty much leaves them alone. The Nation of Islam is based in Chicago, and they pretty much let the Mexican Mafia, the FBI, the CPD, and the CIA commit genocide on the native black population in Chicago over the past 20 fucking years. And I dare somebody come in my comment section to refute what I just said. Not you guys who are my longtime subscribers, but NOI fan heads, don't come in my comment section without receipts, because listen, we know what it is at this point. It's 2023. Okay. So just as Jesus knocked over the money tables, Malcolm became disillusioned at the shady practices of the Nation of Islam, the Fruit of Islam, and the Muslim girls in training. Malcolm X found out that Elijah Muhammad, a Libra, I'm talking about Libras, I'm telling y'all, there's a reason why Venus is associated with Lucifer. Listen. Yeah, Malcolm found out that Elijah Muhammad was taking advantage of the young girls in the organization. He had 23 children and he was exploiting the members financially. And Malcolm did not want to participate in that. As a matter of fact, he didn't even want to be responsible for scamming his people. Like, he felt guilty about the fact that he had pretty much brought his people into an institution that was very corrupt. And he tried to rectify that situation by starting his own organization that was intercultural, interracial, and interdenominational. And this organization was called the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And, you know, he started this and he was killed 9 months later because the NOI wanted him to keep his hands out of their pockets. So they knew that once Malcolm left the nation, that his followers and supporters will leave the nation too. And so they had to kill Malcolm before he took the money bags with him. Okay. So Malcolm X's rebellious moon in Aries, which was cultivated by his mother, had a need or a deep desire to be independent from the scam and to fight for what was right for his people. Although Malcolm wasn't perfect, he was a highly principled man who felt responsible for his people, as shown by his Capricorn ascendant and Saturn in the 11th house placement. Saturn is in dignity in the 11th house. It's at home here. And that means that Malcolm had a very strong Saturn, which was his chart ruler, which was joined by Jupiter in Capricorn. So Malcolm essentially had to work for every bit of luck that he got. Nothing was given to him. So with Jupiter in Capricorn, you have to work for your opportunities. You have to work for your blessings. You have to sacrifice and be patient and be studious and diligent and disciplined to receive your blessings. With Saturn, there's no free lunch. But because Malcolm worked hard for everything that he built, he left a lasting legacy, right? His name is now worth millions of dollars. He's a celebrated and honored historical figure. This is what we mean when we say Saturn represents legacies and time. So his name and his legacy and his works have lasted the test of time, have stood the test of time. He's been dead for almost 60 years and it's like he's never left. That's the power of a strong, highly aspected Saturn. And it's in the 11th house of the collective. So the collective will always remember him. And as time passes, his honors will just continue to grow and grow and grow, right? So yeah, Malcolm's character and integrity was a gift given to him by his activist mother, who taught him to never join any religion and to be open-minded and to make critical decisions based on objective reasoning and logic, not emotional or tribalistic ties. Aries versus Cancer. Malcolm has Aries in the 4th house that is ruled by Cancer. How are you going to liberate yourself from outdated modes of thinking, culture, tradition, history, and your feelings? How do you get out of your feelings enough to get shit done? Don't let fear or pain or anxiety hold you back from doing what you know you have to do. And his mother was an excellent role model for that, to the point where the state had to come in and take her away from her children because she was so strong and resilient. She had a mental breakdown, but that was partially because she was being harassed by the state. She was going through some emotional challenges, with a fuck boy that got her pregnant and did not want to commit to her or take care of the 8 children. And, her children were growing up and she had 8 kids to take care of by herself with little to no resources. Her husband, the primary breadwinner of the household, was killed. So his mother went through so much. And as I was reading her story, I really had to cry for her. She just went through so much shit. But thankfully, after 25 years, her children managed to get her out of that institution and, bring her home around family. And I think she lived until like 90 something years old. She lived until the 80s, I believe. She lived a long life. So I'm hoping that she's at peace now because she went through hell when she was here. So Malcolm's mother was largely responsible for his character development. And the moon represents the mother, the family, early conditioning, and our morality, right? Morals and principles that we get from our mother. If a man has a bad relationship with his mother's, his moral system is messed up for the most part. Now, I'm not saying all men, but many men who do not have a good relationship with their mother have very poor morals and no sense of integrity. Even though Malcolm was separated from his mother, initially he turned into like a life of crime. He became a pimp. He began to exploit women, right? Because of some deep-seated anger and resentment towards women. I understand that, right? That's understandable. But towards the end of his life, when he sought redemption, he started to lean on his mother's teachings to get him out of very difficult situations and to give him the strength and the courage to fight against oppression. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Malcolm had the moon in Aries in his 4th house, which is the home of Cancer, and his Pluto in his 7th house is in the sign of Cancer as well. So in his chart, like, Pluto indicates that throughout Malcolm's life, he was at war with himself because he was desperately trying to find out who he truly was. And this conflict manifested in his relationships with other people. The 7th house, again, is the house of open enemies, business partnerships, marriages, and the other, right? Malcolm had both Pluto and Mars in this house in a trine aspect to Saturn and Pluto. Trines represent opportunities and gifts, and Pluto in the 7th can bring about complicated relationships with dangerous, powerful enemies who appear to be friends. Why do they appear to be friends? Because in Malcolm's chart, Pluto is trining the 11th house of friendships, right? And And as I mentioned earlier, Malcolm's relationship with the NOI was friendly. It was symbiotic. They both benefited from their relationship with each other, right? And, you know, the NOI helped Malcolm to establish a legacy for himself. However, because Saturn is involved and Pluto is involved and Mars is involved, this relationship got inevitably gnarly and nasty and violent, basically, because Mars always brings about violence. Mars and Pluto together is pretty much death. And again, I think I saw this in Whitney Houston's chart as well. Whitney Houston was born into a family of celebrities, and she was introduced to Clive Davis through her mother, I believe. Clive Davis is mafia. He used to work for the CIA. And Whitney did not know this. She thought that, you know, Clive Davis loves me. He's my friend. He's going to help me become a successful star. Yeah, at the expense of your life and your peace and your happiness and your freedom. This is what happens when Pluto and Mars in the 7th house. Like, it's, you know, it looks good in the beginning. There's lots of money involved, lots of success, lots of power and fame and prominence and protection even. But if you turn against the mafia and you don't do what the mafia wants you to do, you got to go. The NOI is a mafia organization, just like the FBI, just like the CIA, just like any other organization that uses violence to make money. Do you know how many black people or people in the music industry have been killed by the mafia for their masters, for their catalog? You know, Michael Jackson went through the same thing. Like Prince went through the same thing. That's what it is with Pluto in the 7th house. That's right. Michael had Pluto in the 7th house too. Okay. So, you know, he was a very powerful figure, but he was going up against some really, really strong, powerful secret enemies. Pluto is about secrets too. Mars, not so much, but Pluto, absolutely. Secret assassinations, secret business deals, COINTELPRO, manipulation, mind games. That's all Plutonian shit you can't see at the surface. You just notice that something's different and you don't know why it's different, but something ain't right here. Why is everything different? And we can't see why this country's falling apart. We don't know who's killing these people. We don't know where these drugs are coming from. Secretive nonsense. The cartels, the FBI, the CIA, the military, like, you know, just covert activities and operations that destroy shit and nobody knows why it's destroyed. Like, who did it? Pluto in the 7th is like unsolved mysteries. Who killed this person? Who killed Whitney? Who killed Michael? Who killed Malcolm? Right? And when nobody knows who killed a powerful, prominent person like Jeffrey Epstein, more than likely the government was involved. Okay? More than likely the mafia is involved. It's not a mystery at this point. We're in 2023. This is what it is. All right. Back to the interpretation. So, the trine with Pluto and Saturn in the 11th house of friendships did show that Malcolm's relationship with the NOI was initially a friendly, symbiotic one that helped to establish his legacy. Saturn is the planet of legacy, karmic obligations, restrictions, delays, and the cause of death. Malcolm helped the NOI to grow not only in prominence and power, but also financially, as Saturn is in his sign of other people's money. The NOI became a lucrative business due to Malcolm's powerful influence. However, because Pluto and Mars, the dispositors of Saturn and Scorpio, are in the 7th house of open enemies, the admiration and joy bestowed upon Malcolm from the NOI soon turned into distrust, greed, jealousy, and ultimately betrayal. Scorpio. Malcolm also has Neptune in Leo, and the Neptune in Leo is squaring his sun. Neptune represents addictions. He had addiction to drugs and alcohol. It represents delusions, disillusionment, fantasies, hopes, dreams, and wishes, and an idealism that becomes self-destructive or just not realistic, right? So Malcolm X had an unrealistic understanding or perspective about the Nation of Islam. He expected the Nation of Islam to basically stop making money for the sake of helping its people, which is something that's noble to want, but it wasn't realistic. Most people are money hungry. And so even Farrakhan said it. Farrakhan was like, you know, if we killed him, he was one of our own. What business is that of yours, right? So the Nation of Islam felt like they owned Malcolm X. They felt like they made him. Pluto in the 7th house. You belong to me. Without me, you would not exist. But with Malcolm X, he was already the man. It's just that the Nation of Islam gave him a platform. When Malcolm found out about Elijah Muhammad, he was very disillusioned. He was in a lot of pain. He was upset. He was conflicted. He didn't know what to do. But he knew that he did not want to participate in the fleecing and exploitation of his people under the guise of Black power liberation. I mean, just like Dr. King, when he said that, I feel like I led my people into a burning building, Malcolm felt that he had inadvertently betrayed his community and his race by being the front man for a corrupt criminal organization that wanted to financially exploit the people he was trying to liberate. So again, Malcolm was not only at war with himself, he was at war with his country. He was at war with the Nation of Islam. He was even at war with his family to some extent, because the Nation of Islam had convinced his family or brainwashed his family into turning their backs against him. Muhammad Ali turned their backs against him too. So he was pretty much like on no man's land, and he was trying to do the right thing. That's a tragedy in a situation. That's why I titled this A Crown of Thorns. Malcolm X was a king, yes. He was coronated by blood and pain and sacrifice, not through luxury and leisure and wealth handed down by the parents. Like Malcolm X's family was damn near destitute, but now they're relatively wealthy compared to where they used to be. To this day, there are things happening to Malcolm's descendants and his children, his grandchildren in particular, that people don't understand. I think that one of his youngest daughters was found dead in Brooklyn a couple of years ago. No cause of death was found. I don't know if it's changed since then, but I remember reading that she died and they didn't know what caused her death, right? His grandson, who accidentally killed his widow by burning down her house. You've seen this burning house thing. Malcolm's childhood home was burned down by the KKK. The Nation of Islam burned down his home when he was with his daughters. And his grandson burned down his grandmother's home, who was his widow. Like, this is something that's very, very deep. The destruction of one's homeland. You won't be able to rest until you identify who you are. There is not going to be any peace for you on this land until what? Until what? But in summary, the challenges in Malcolm's life can be linked to the Pluto and Mars conjunction in his 7th house of open enemies and business partnerships. His business partners became his open enemies. However, because Pluto was involved, they were always his enemy, but he didn't know this. So secret enemies or hidden enemies become open enemies. And with the opposition to the ascendant, his open enemies caused his death. And this was something that was plotted in secret because Jupiter, the ruler of the 12th house, is in the 1st house, dying for one's beliefs, dying for one's principles, dying for one's ideologies, dying for one's religious practices. Malcolm, like Martin, was trying to unite the people. But when you unite the people, then you can't get the bag. The elites create division among the people to keep the bag going. If I hate you for your gender, your sexuality, your complexion, your religion, your race, your nationality, your age, your income, they create all these divisions to keep us separated and fighting each other so they can keep getting the bag. And Malcolm X was trying to stop that. But he was trying to do it by himself and he needed more help. He had some help, but again, Pluto and Mars together, those are really powerful enemies. Saturn, the 11th house together, these are really powerful institutions, legacy institutions that still exist to this day. Okay. Now, after Malcolm X was killed and Elijah Muhammad died, his eldest son took over the Nation of Islam and pretty much disbanded it because he wanted to become Sunni Islam and not the bullshit that we see today. However, Farrakhan, another Taurus who's a builder, said, hell no, this is popping right here. We got the bag. We got the money. The show must go on. I'm not saying that the Nation of Islam does not do anything good for the community. I'm not saying that at all. But the NOI is not what people think that it is. It's not. Okay? And the NOI did not kill Malcolm because Malcolm was going to betray the nation. No. The NOI killed Malcolm because Malcolm was going to fuck up the money. He was going to fuck up the bag. He was going to expose Elijah Muhammad as a predator. Okay? And so when you have powerful institutions and entities and organizations They will do anything to protect the money. They will do anything to protect the legacy or the idea of who people think they are to keep garnering money and attention. The main reason why the NOI is still popping to this day is because of Malcolm X. Farrakhan has done some work. Yes, he's been the head of the NOI for about 50 years now, or almost 50 years. He's done his thing. We can't deny that. But he ain't doing shit about shit, to keep it 100. As a matter of fact, the conditions of Black Americans in this country has declined precipitously since the 1970s. All these drugs and guns and crime and shit in our community, but the NOI is not doing anything to protect the community that it's fleecing. For decades, nothing. We have record unemployment among the men, drug abuse, mental health issues. Like I said, I'm not saying that the NOI does not have a good program for cleaning up these men. I'm not saying that at all. But my problem is, and Malcolm's problem was, is that you had to be part of the NOI for them to want to help you. You got to be part of the cult. You got to be part of the program. You got to be part of the game, the hustle, for me to want to help you out. Otherwise, you're just another nigga. Fuck you. You can die in the streets of Chicago right in front of the fucking Temple number 2. Like, nobody knows what happened to Clarence X. Nobody knows what happened to Khalid Muhammad. Nobody knows what happened to all these men who were trying to do the right thing and mysteriously died and disappeared at the hands of the NOI. Pluto in the 7th house. Okay? The Nation of Islam was formed on July 4th, 1930. This is Sun in Cancer and Pluto in Cancer. So as I said before, Malcolm X's war with the Nation of Islam was a reflection of his war within himself. Because the Nation of Islam was hiding certain things about the people who they were trying to protect. They were hiding their identities to an extent. And then Malcolm started saying, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Uh-oh, flag on the play. Can't do that. Can't say that. That's a red flag. Watch your mouth. July 4th, 1930. July 4th is what? Independence Day? What the irony of that? The irony of this. It's a game, as Dick Gregory would say. It's a game. Okay? But I'm going to leave it there. I appreciate you listening to this. I'm sorry if it was a difficult listen, but it is what it is. I got to keep it 100 with you guys. I look forward to reading your feedback. If you want to order your own personal reading, you can go to my website. The link's in the description box. Fill out the order entry form and submit payment via CashApp or credit card. Again, I look forward to reading your feedback. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will speak to you soon. Happy birthday, El-Hajj!